Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. So welcome everybody to Tuesday meditation. And it's been kind of, I always like to comment about the weather. It's kind of like nice August weather. Lots of sun. And so today, or a couple of weeks ago, I think, I got this book. Always kind of like interested in Buddhist history. And this book is about the kind of development of mass meditation in Burma in the turn of the 20th century. And kind of very interesting, actually around the 100th year after the Buddha's parinibbāna, about a couple hundred years before, that was about like the 1900s, maybe, around that time. I can't remember the exact year that it was. They call it the Buddha Jayanti, 100th year. You know the date, Ravi? 1956. 1956 was the 100th year. And around the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century, in actually all three main Theravada countries, kind of independently and out of nowhere, there was this sudden and unexplained revival in monastic discipline and in meditation. Those two things went hand in hand. It's very unusual. But in Thailand, they have what they call the Thai forest tradition. In Sri Lanka, there was a movement by 2 or 3 groups of monks to try to reestablish standards of monastic discipline and return to living in the forest. And in Burma, there was this movement against British colonialism that led to mass meditation and the kind of hallmark of Burmese meditation, which is very kind of like technique, you do step A, because they're very impressed, I think, with the Western ability to like mass produce goods, mass produce food, mass produce, weapons. Westerners did this by standardizing things. So they thought, we'll standardize meditation techniques. And when you look at the kind of history of Buddhism, it's like a kind of very fascinating history. It goes through all these kind of periods of rise and fall. And its periods of rise and fall are very interesting to track. It never really, from my limited understanding, it never really seems to be the same thing all the time. So actually, Buddhism was founded in India, and the way that it died out in India is kind of very interesting too. It's kind of this dual approach where actually what happened was the monks, the Buddha, there were certain questions he never talked about. Certain things that when people asked them those questions, he would just not answer them. Or he'd say, these are kind of things that I won't talk about. It's kind of, is the world eternal? Is it not eternal? Is it finite or is it infinite? So in other words, is the universe infinite or finite? It's kind of, does the Tathāgata, in other words, does an arahant, does he exist after he dies? Does he not exist? Does he both exist and not exist? Does he neither exist nor not exist? In other words, a lot of these questions deal with what in philosophy they call ontology. Kind of ontology, as is kind of this word they use in this book, is kind of means the study of whether or not things are real. What's really real out there. And so in this period in India, about 500 years after the Buddha died, actually the Buddha made this prediction that 500 years after his passing away, the true Dhamma would no longer be there. And about 500 years after his passing away, all these various commentaries started coming up. Before, in the time of the Buddha, you only had the suttas and the Vinaya, and a third set which was called the Matakas. These Matakas were headings that they used to kind of like, the Buddha will list things like compassion, these various things, these kind of things, and they would list them. So these lists were called matakas. In the period after his passing away, there developed this age of commenting on the Buddhist teachings, where people would take various suttas and they'd write these commentaries on them. And these commentaries, and some of them started to go in all these, different directions. And a lot of what they were commenting on, a lot of the development in Buddhist tradition 500 years after the Buddha's death was precisely about questions which he said should be put aside. Precisely about things which he said worth thinking about. So the interesting thing was there was this, you have what they call in the Buddhist canon, you've got the Sutta Pitaka, the Vinaya Pitaka, and you've got what's called the Abhidhamma Pitaka. Now this thing about the Abhidhamma Pitaka is very interesting because at the time after, 500 years or so after the Buddha's death, all these various schools of Buddhism started to arise, and they each had their own Abhidhammas. And these Abhidhammas were used to describe what's really out there in the world, like what's really real in the cosmos. And they disagreed. So there was one school who said, okay, there really is a self, there's a true self, but the Buddha just didn't say it. There was another school who said, okay, the various elements that make up the universe, they really exist, they're eternal. They exist all the time, in the past, the present, and the future. Then there's our school, the Theravada school. They said, okay, they exist in the present, they existed in the past, but they don't exist in the future. So in other words, all these various philosophical schools came up, and they started to argue with each other. And then later on, these various people started to say, the whole world is just consciousness. That's all it is. Wait a minute. No, the whole world isn't consciousness, it's all emptiness. All these various kind of philosophies. So you had these schools that were called like the Yogacharans. And the other ones, I can't remember the name of the other one, the one who thought it was mind only. And from this kind of development of Buddhist philosophy, Buddhism started to become really similar to Hinduism. Kind of more and more similar. To the extent in the end phases of Buddhism in India, you had what was called, them taking on practices that were called like tantric practices, where you imagine like Buddha's coming into you and you kind of try to like shortcut your way to enlightenment. And as all this was going on, there were two things that happened to kind of seal the nail in the, hammer the nail in the coffin for Buddhism in India. One of them, it's kind of very interesting. I actually didn't know about one of these. I knew about was there was a Muslim invasion, kind of the invasion of the Turks. And the Turks at that time were kind of very fanatical. They just basically killed everybody who was not part of their religion. And so the Buddhists were kind of very, at that time they'd all kind of collected in these universities. And they weren't really out amongst the people too much. So the Turks just basically destroyed the universities. And that kind of cut off the main centers of Buddhism. But the second thing which was really interesting, which actually destroyed Buddhism in India, is very interesting. When you read these histories of the turning points of Buddhism, it often turns around these extremely charismatic figures. Kind of, like in the business world, in the West, we really value science and technology. You've got your Einsteins, right? You've got your Steve Jobs, or your Bill Gates, and these are all these very charismatic, powerful figures who somehow, through the force of both their personality and their genius, they effect turning points within that culture. And there was this one kind of Hindu monk whose name was Adi Shankara. And he basically started to, in India at the time, he started to argue with some of these later developments in Buddhist philosophy. And so basically the main difference the funny thing was, one of his teachers was a Buddhist. His teacher's teacher was a Buddhist. But he was from this school that said everything is just consciousness. So in other words, not to bog everybody down in the details of philosophy, but he went around arguing with Buddhists because at the time the Buddhist doctrine had become there's no self. There's absolutely, nothing. So basically it's, almost, okay, well what happens then? When you die, you're not annihilated. So he ran around arguing there is a self. And he was a very good debater. So he would go and challenge all these various Buddhists to arguments. And he'd say, okay, if I win, you and all your disciples have to convert to Hinduism. But if you win, I'll convert with all my disciples to Buddhism. And he would do this, I think, quite a lot. He would have these really high stakes debates with people, and then crowds of people would go attend. And it was through this way. Actually, I didn't know about this until a while. Found out about this a while ago. He, through the force of his personality, basically, and coupled with the Muslim invasion, basically converted huge numbers of people from Buddhism to Hinduism. And he died at 32. So he died very, very young. But in any event, the interesting thing was that the topics these debates hinged on were actually questions that the Buddha didn't talk about, that he refused to answer. It's kind of one of the interesting things is if you go through the list of wrong views that a person develops when they start thinking about the wrong questions, they develop this view, I have a self. Then they develop another view, I have no self. Then they develop another view, it's with the self that I perceive no self. And they have another view, it's with no self that I perceive the self. Then they've got another view, the self of mine is this knower, basically the one who watches, basically just consciousness, that's my true self. So in other words, when a person starts thinking about these various types of views, they fall into one of these traps. These are kind of ontological traps. Kind of use this word ontological again, not to make this sound like some university discussion or whatever. I'm not a university professor. But that's the word they use when they want to describe, is something really real or is it not real? In other words, when a person sends their mind out to ask these questions, these kind of questions which actually always tend to form very often some of what we call the deepest thinking in philosophy, that's precisely when they get caught in what the Buddha calls a wilderness of views, a thicket of views. It gives this kind of image, like this kind of a writhing of views, a tangle of views. In other words, it's like, in those old fairy tales when they'd have these walls of thorns around the castle, and people would try to duck under the thorns and they'd get caught. And they'd get caught here, caught there, or they get caught, the thorns would catch them and tear them. And in the same way, when a person starts thinking this way, is the outside world real? Is it not real? Is the outside world all consciousness? Is it not consciousness? Is consciousness myself? Is it not? By the way, the Buddha says consciousness is not self, Is the world finite? Is the world infinite? They get caught in thinking about things which are a tangle of views. In other words, they have almost no end to these kind of speculations. And the interesting thing, when I think with modern instruments, right? Kind of with physics. Okay, these are good. Physics is really, I find it fascinating what they're able to know about the universe. But the interesting thing is that in the course of my lifetime, their conception about the way that the universe expands and its nature has changes all the time. You had this Big Bang theory, then the universe is expanding, and there's going to be a point where there's a big crunch and it contracts. But then, okay, wait a minute, there's this unexpected, dark energy. We don't know what it is. It's pushing the universe out faster than we know. Now the universe won't crunch. It's just going to keep expanding infinitely. So in other words, the universe is infinite. Wait a minute, the universe isn't infinite, it's finite. Wait a minute, there is a self, there's no self. There both is a self and not a self. Does the Tathāgata exist after death? He doesn't exist after death. Now the reason why these views are called a wilderness of views, a thicket of views, is because when a person thinks about them, they become blinded to the cause and effect relationships that are going on with suffering in their own life. So this is what the Buddha says. There's things that he teaches about, he doesn't teach about. What he does teach about is suffering and the ending of suffering. That's all he teaches. That's his purpose in teaching. So there's very kind of interesting sutta where the Buddha's walking through the forest, and they have this kind of tree in India still, have it imagine. It's called the Simsapa tree. And a Simsapa tree has leaves that are like the size of a dime. They're like this big. So he, kneels there, bends down and picks up a handful of these Simsapa leaves. You can imagine not that many. And he says, monks, what do you think is more? The number of leaves in my hand or the number of leaves in the trees overhead? And the monks say, the number of leaves in your hand is less. Of course, the number of trees is more. or the number of leaves in the trees are more. And the Buddha says, well, of course, in the same way, the number of things that I've known through the direct knowledge are few. Are great, like the leaves in the trees. The number of things that I've taught are few, like the leaves in my hands. Right? So, why is that? Because these things that I haven't taught don't lead to the end of suffering, basically. They don't lead to dispassion. The things that I have taught lead to the end of suffering, lead to dispassion. So the interesting thing is that when a person, when a tradition, when Buddhism as a whole, when a philosophy as a whole becomes focused outwards, as at least Buddhist philosophies, on what's really real, what's not real, and we're stumbling into then a territory that's a thicket of views, that's a wilderness of views, that's a writhing of views. Actually, the Sutta Pitaka is immense. What the Buddha actually did taught, although it's a hand of leaves, it's thousands and thousands and thousands of pages. And actually, I haven't read the whole thing. There are some monks who've read the whole thing, and there's even monks who've memorized it. But to actually absorb that quantity of, say, written information is, it's a lifetime's work if you wanted to do it. But it's not necessary to do that, really. It's not necessary to memorize the whole Sutta Pitaka to learn about what the Buddha taught. There's this very interesting sutta as well, where there's a person who goes up to the Buddha and he says, Lord, is it possible to reach the end of the universe by traveling? And the Buddha says, I declare that it's impossible to reach the end of the universe by traveling. In other words, even if you had a spaceship going at warp 110, Star Trek, it was like a warp 9. That was the fastest they could go. Okay, we got warp 110. You still can't reach the end of the universe. And then this man said, it's amazing how well that was stated by the Blessed One. He said, in my last life, I was what they call a skywalker. So in other words, maybe a deva who had psychic powers. And he said, my stride was like this. In one step, I could step over the whole ocean. And some of these devas have amazing powers. And he said, my speed was like this. It was like an arrow, kind of shot. I can't remember the exact term, but as fast as an arrow. And he said, with this speed and with this stride, this wish arose in me. May I reach the end of the universe. And so he started traveling. And he said, with a lifespan of 100 years, only stopping to urinate and defecate, I didn't reach the end of the world, or the end of the universe, but I died along the way. Then I guess eventually he got born as a human. And the Buddha says, it's interesting. He says, although it's not possible to reach the end of the universe by traveling, he says, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, I declare the end of the universe in this fathom-long body. In other words, the end of the universe is right here in the body. It's here in the eye, here in the nose, here in the ears, here in the tongue, here in the body, here in the mind. And it's because it's through these senses that we know the universe. It's through these senses the universe comes to be for us. And so the cessation of the world can be known through these senses as well. What this means practically is that it isn't necessary to gain a whole ton of external knowledge about what's out there, what's really real in the world. It isn't necessary even to memorize the whole Sutta Pitaka. It isn't necessary even to, say, be some sort of expert on the Sutta Pitaka. Actually, there's this interesting sutta where the Buddha says, how is one learned, an expert on the Dhamma? He says, one is a learned expert on the Dhamma if one memorizes even a 4-stanza line and practices in line with it. That's enough for one to be called learned, an expert on the Dhamma. In other words, everything that the Buddha taught is about the beginning and ending of suffering. And when we look for the beginning and ending of suffering, we don't need to look for it in a really complex theory. We don't need to look for it in a huge body of knowledge. We don't need to look for it anywhere else but in this fathom-long body. This fathom-long body is where the universe arises. This fathom-long body is where the universe ceases. It's here that suffering arises. It's here that suffering ceases. And if a person follows the Buddha's teachings, then they can come to know for themselves what he's talking about in the handful of leaves. And even when people follow the Buddhist teachings, when we come to practice, then sometimes you stumble across things that are like the leaves. People stumble across things that are like the leaves in the forest. They're things that the Buddha hasn't taught about, and yet they're real nonetheless. They're real parts of our practice that we have to work with. It's for this reason that at the beginning of the meditation, that the emphasis in meditation is on meditation as a skill, on meditation as something that we learn about directly by observing cause and effect. Because even the Anapanasati Sutta, which describes mindfulness of breathing, is very terse. It's like breathe in and out, relaxing the body. Breathe in and out, feeling pleasure. Breathe in and out, feeling rapture. How do you do that? The actual specifics of that are in the leaves and the trees. The actual details of that are in the trees. And so we have to learn about these leaves ourselves by investigating right here in this fathom-long body. The nice thing about this is that the Buddhist teachings, because they're aimed at the ending of suffering, whenever we look at them, they don't shoot outwards so much, right? They don't shoot outwards to the end of the world. They don't shoot outwards to how a car engine works. They don't shoot outwards to how the sun rotates around the earth, whatever mathematical formula that is. Wherever we look at them, they're like a boomerang. However far out they go, they wind up back here. They wind up back with the actions that we're taking or not taking right now that lead to the accumulation of good and bad qualities, that lead to the accumulation of suffering and ease, that lead to the accumulation of pain and happiness. Because all these qualities start with us, because all of them end with us, there's something that we can manipulate. There's something that we can find out about by sitting down and meditating with our eyes closed wherever we are. We can learn about the ending of the universe right here at the tip of their nose. Because in the same way the breath comes in and out, in the same way it rises and falls, the world rises and falls. There's this interesting thing in science, they call it scale invariance. In other words, there's some laws in science where you can't tell. Whatever happens, that law applies the same way on a small scale that it does at a really large scale. So if you look at these kind of like mountain dunes in Arizona, and you look at an overhead photo of like a mountain dune, you can't tell if the mountain's like 100 feet high or if it's like, a little hill this big. It's because the principles that lead to the eroding away of that mountain are the same. It's the same law. And the same laws that occur in the universe occur right here. So we learn about these laws. We learn about the way the mind works. We learn about the way that suffering and pain arises and ceases, not for the sake of gaining external knowledge, but for the sake of fulfilling the Buddha's tasks. Because he taught the Dhamma for this purpose, to know suffering and to know its end, to find out how to end suffering. Whoever practices in the way that he describes, whoever learns these things for themselves, can directly know in their own minds the growth and decline of wholesome and unwholesome qualities. They can directly see in their own minds the arising, passing away of peaceful and unpeaceful states. They can directly gain for themselves the skill to make their mind what they need it to be, to shape their mind, to mold it, to make it malleable, to make it pliable, to make it fit for work, to make it a tool, like a hammer or whatever other tool that can accomplish its purpose. When a person molds their mind in this way, when they train it in this way, they can direct it how they like. They can direct it to know about the arising away and passing of pleasant and unpleasant feelings. They can direct it to know about making the mind calm and making the mind peaceful. But most importantly, they can direct it to try to find what it is that causes them to suffer, period. They can direct it to the destruction of the taints in their mind, to the permanent destruction, to the future non-arising, to the complete cessation of suffering. And this is a real possibility for people who search for the ending of the world, not outside in the various ontological questions, not in the rotation of the sun, not in whether a Tathāgata exists or doesn't exist after death, but who search for the beginning and the ending of the world right here in the fathom-long body, who search for suffering and stress right here. For these people, they come to know what's in that handful of leaves that the Buddha taught about. And this is the best thing that a person can do with their life. It's the best thing that a person can discover. It's the best thing that a person can realize, which is the ending of suffering.